I think if we took the time to listen to each other, we would see that we have a culture where so many parents have to teach their children to be afraid in order to be secure. I heard moving comments on the floor today about one of my colleagues who listened to their staffers where their kids were told by their parents to keep your receipts because you'll be accused of stolen things. I know from my own experiences, having guns drawn on me, being accused of stealing things. The challenge is that this often is unfair, it is unacceptable, it is wrong, but when it explodes like we see it, where people capture on videotape the kind of violence that you were, traumatizing violence that you were going to show. I'm really grateful for Senator Harris, who's been my partner over the last few weeks. And she and I did, as was said by the ranking member, work together with Congressional Black Caucus leaders and ultimately Chairman Nadler to put together a bill called the Justice in Policing Act. We put it together, obviously, in the wake of George Floyd. We put it in the wake of not just black men, a black woman sleeping in her home, and the deaths that have brought to attention much of this in our national discourse, and indeed have brought in all 50 states literally thousands of protests of people of all backgrounds. I mean all backgrounds, not just race, religion, Republicans and Democrats, who've been calling for an end, a meaningful reform. And yet, even in the days since Kamala and I put together our work with other members of this Senate, as well as people in the House, we continue to see things caught in videotape. As was said before, Rashard Brooks shot in the back. So we need to be very clear. What we're talking about is a nation that has two different justice systems, two different experiences with law enforcement that go all the way up to this body. If you stop and talk to the black people who work here, who have very personal stories, including Senator Tim Scott's eloquent exposition on the Senate floor, the unmitigated killing of unarmed black people in America by law enforcement, not to mention the disparate treatment, is something that we must do something about. We have a choice right now. Now, I'm about 51 years old, and since a little bit before my birth till now, there have been so many studies, so many commissions, from the Kerner Commission all the way up to the 21st Century Task Force on Policing, and nothing has changed. Cities from Ferguson to Minneapolis have done a lot of reforms, and as the data has shown, whether it's diversifying your police force, a lot of these things have been done before, but we still see the killing of unarmed African Americans. And so we really have a choice to make, and every day that we don't do something puts more and more of our fellow citizens in danger, not just of death, but of the kind of treatment we would never want our own family to face. We have a choice before us. And so this idea that there is a Republican bill and a Democratic bill, we need to look beyond that for a second and simply understand that the things that are in the bill that Senator Harris and I worked on actually have wild popularity amongst Republicans. You hear Republican leaders, from George Bush, his first address to Congress, said we should stop racially profiling Americans. That's not something radical. It's this idea that we're equal under the law. From chokeholds to no-knock warrants, things that would have saved lives, we have failed to do in this country by making them the law of the land, setting standards for practices in policing that reflect our common values. Republicans and Democrats overwhelmingly support these kind of practices being banned in our country that are in our bill. They would save lives. Breonna Taylor would be alive today. Eric Garner could be alive today. But it's not just setting a standard. Accountability is having ways of measuring progress to those standards. We are a nation that doesn't even collect the data on how many people are shot by police. I ran a police department. I learned the hard way. Without data, there can be no accountability. Without measures. I played football. It's not, the standard is you got to be fast to be a wide receiver. If you have no way of measuring that, what good is the standard? Activists, local leaders, the federal government, we all should have transparency into policing. Without that, no accountability. And finally, you said it yourself. Took note of what you said, Mr. Chairman. that unless there are real consequences when you fail to meet standards, whether it's lawsuits or federal action, criminal court, there are two aspects of this bill. Changing a standard in the criminal courts, it's almost difficult, if not impossible, to meet the willfulness standard. That's common sense. And God, qualified immunity, I could start listing, and for sake of time I won't, all the conservative organizations from the Cato Institute, from the remarks of Clarence Thomas, that support getting rid of qualified immunity. And so I worry in this moment, I really do, that we're going to repeat history, that this is the movie Groundhog Day. Because here we are again, in a nightmare, not a comedy. That here we hear talks of, again, a so-called reform packages, more studies, more nibbling around the edges, as opposed to acting boldly and doing the things that we actually know will hold police officers accountable for their conduct, which will set meaningful standards, will allow us as a federal government to enforce a law. This is not an overstatement or an over-dramatization to say that the stakes right now are high. Will we meet this moment in history and actually do something real, or will we find ourselves back here again a year from now, 3 years from now, with mass protests in the streets by people of all different backgrounds demanding change? And so, Mr. Chairman, the truth is, I actually have faith in us as a country. I don't have faith we're going to get there on time, and justice delayed is justice denied. I, though, believe that there's going to be a time in America when we ban inhuman practices like chokeholds and religious profiling and no-knock entries. I believe there'll be a time in America where we don't treat mental health issues with police in prison. I believe there's going to be a time in America where a black woman is safe to sleep in her own bed, or a young man reaching for his cell phone won't get shot dead. I believe there will be a time in America when black parents, like mine, don't have to fear for the safety of their child who just got their driver's license. I believe there will be a time in America when we understand that public safety is not about simply the number of police on our streets, but about the number of people who no longer live in poverty or are safe to drink their water or don't have to deal with addiction in prison but can get treatment. There will be a time, I know, in this country, but if the arc of the moral universe is long and bends towards justice, we have to have the courage now to be the arc benders. The question is not, will we get there? The question is the time now. How many more people have to die in our streets to get us there? How many more people have to suffer the indignities that even our own colleagues have talked about in the United States Senate? I believe the time should be now for us to make bold change, or we will be back here again. These changes will happen, but they should not happen someday. This should be the day. This should be the time so that we can ensure that this nightmare ends in America. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, could I have 1 minute, please?
Yes, you can.
Yes. I want to point out how my state of Iowa is not waiting around for Congress to act. In an 8-day session since the death of Mr. Floyd, Governor Reynolds signed a bill that was unanimously passed by both houses. And why I'm somewhat familiar with this is because my grandson's Speaker of the Iowa House, but it brings additional accountability to Iowa's law enforcement officers by creating stronger restrictions on the use of chokeholds by law enforcement officers, improving law enforcement decertification process to ensure that those who've been fired or resigned after serious misconduct do not work in our state, strengthen the authority of the Iowa Attorney General to prosecute officers whose actions result in death of another, and establishing an annual anti-bias and de-escalation training requirements for officers. I yield.
Thank you. Senator Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Feinstein, for holding this hearing and for the sincerity with which you have approached the subject. And I thank all of our colleagues for what I do believe to be a meaningful discussion with a real commitment to do the work of this committee, which is to do the work of supporting the concepts of justice in America, which include equal under the law, meaning all people will be treated equally by our laws, and we will enforce our laws equally. So I want to thank the entire committee. I want to thank Senator Booker for the courage that you always have to speak truth and your willingness to tell the personal stories. And it takes a lot of courage to do that. And you do that not because it is easy, but because you know it needs to be done. And I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, people from every age, gender, race, and religion have been coming together for weeks to protest injustice against black people in America. We have a duty as United States Senators to be fully aware of our country's history of systemic racism and a responsibility to take serious action toward achieving America's founding ideal of equal justice under law. When we say that America has a history of systemic racism, we mean that from slavery, Jim Crow laws, lynchings, and policing, our institutions have done violence to black Americans. And it has caused black Americans to be treated as less than human across time, place, and institution. Let's be clear about what it would mean then to transform our society and eliminate systemic racism. When we truly achieve that ideal, we won't have an unarmed black man, George Floyd, die from a police officer kneeling on his neck for almost 8 minutes and 48 seconds, actually, exactly 8 minutes and 48 seconds. When we achieve that ideal, it won't mean that we'll have a woman, Breonna Taylor, shot and killed by police officers while she's asleep in her own bed. We won't have an unarmed black man, Ahmaud Arbery, lynched while going for a run in his own neighborhood. And as George Floyd's brother, Philanese, said last week in his powerful testimony before the House Judiciary Committee, when we eliminate systemic racism, it will be clear to everyone that the life of a black man is worth more than an allegedly counterfeit $20 bill. Mr. Chairman, there is a movement being led by people who might appear from the outside to have little in common, who are marching together to demand an end to the black blood that is staining the sidewalks of our country. They are marching together to move us close and closer at least to justice. And that gives me hope. It truly gives me hope when I look at who is out there and the commonality of purpose and the unity that they are exhibiting. But we have to recognize that to deal with systemic inequity in our system, it's not just a policing issue. Inequities are also deeply rooted in our education system, in our housing system, in our workforces, in our healthcare delivery system, and more. And we must fully value black life, invest in black communities, and root out inequity wherever it lives. That means that across the nation we must reimagine what public safety looks like. The status quo thinking that more police creates more safety is wrong. It's wrong. And it has motivated too much of municipal budgets and the thinking of policymakers, and has distracted them from what truly will be the smartest use of resources to achieve safety in communities, which is to invest in the health of those communities, and healthy communities, without any doubt, are safe communities. So we must ask our mayors and local leaders to re-examine their priorities and their budgets. We must ask why so much money is being spent to militarize the police, while 2/3 of public school teachers in America today are coming out of their own back pockets to help pay for school supplies in our public schools. It's time for us to realize this is not just a moment, but a movement. This committee and our entire federal government have a role to play in holding the police accountable when they break the rules and break the law. and we must be on the right side of history as a committee. We can start to meet the demands of this movement by passing the Justice and Policing Act. And here are a few specific ways. First, we need a national use of force standard. Today, most officers around the country, the standard is to ask if they use excessive force, the standard is to ask, was that use of force reasonable? A much more fair and just question to ask is, was that use of force necessary? We need a national use of force standard. Second, as a former prosecutor, I know that independent investigations into police misconduct are imperative. No matter how well-intentioned a district attorney or a state's attorney, when called upon to investigate the misconduct of a police officer that works in the department they closely work with every day, there will at the very least be an appearance of conflict, if not actual conflict. To do justice in our country is to actually do justice and to have the confidence of the public that there is an appearance of justice. These values are equal. Third, we need truth and transparency. Cities and states have to report police use of force incidents to the federal government. When I was Attorney General of California, I created an open data initiative we named Open Justice, a first of its kind open data initiative to give the people access to information about arrests, bookings, and deaths in custody. The public has a right to know what has happened and what is happening in their communities. And the public can then use that data to help hold us accountable. Instead of requiring that they are always presenting anecdotal information fueled by personal experiences, when the data is available but we as government possess it, is it not the right and equitable thing to do? To share that data which we as government possess with the public so they can grade and judge us appropriately. And lastly, we need to expand pattern and practice investigations into police departments and give state attorneys general the authority to bring these investigations. As Attorney General of California, I activated civil pattern and practice investigations into police departments. And recall, as Senator Feinstein mentioned, Congress gave the Department of Justice authority to conduct pattern and practice investigations in the aftermath of Rodney King's killing by police officers, or beating, by police officers. This power is designed to root out systemic problems in police departments. And under the Trump administration, sadly, pattern and practice investigations have slowed virtually to a stop. They need to start these investigations again with an additional tool of subpoena power. And on this point, Attorney General Barr should be here today. He should be here to answer for his shameful record investigating civil rights violations in police departments in America. During the Trump administration, the United States Department of Justice has confirmed only one pattern and practice investigation compared to 25 brought during the Obama administration. He should be here to answer for reportedly calling for the forcible removal of peaceful demonstrators who were gathered in front of the White House to protest the murder of George Floyd, and he should be here to answer for his lack of leadership at this critical moment in our nation's history. Today, President Trump issued an executive order calling for accreditation standards for police departments, data sharing on police officers who use excessive force, and federal funding to help police respond to the homeless and mentally ill. Let me be clear, this is not enough. It does not meet this moment. This is not enough. There are thousands of people marching in the streets in 50 states demanding meaningful change. The people are demanding action. They are not marching in the streets for watered-down proposals that won't hold any officers accountable. And there is nothing about what the President announced today that would hold police officers who break the rules and break the law accountable. The only way to meaningfully access police brutality is through comprehensive reforms, including reforms to hold bad officers accountable for misconduct. The Justice and Policing Act is certainly not the end, but the beginning of establishing national standards and accountability for police departments. And at a certain point, we've seen enough. We've had enough commissions. We have studied these issues. We have convened opinion leaders. We have talked about these in private conversations and in public conversations. Now is time to act. The people are demanding it. And they have a right to know that their government, a representative government of the people, will respond to their needs for us as a country to live up to our ideals. So in closing, I'll just say that, we know that we have these words across the street at the United States Supreme Court etched into that beautiful marble building: equal justice under law. But we have to show America what it means, and that it truly means equal justice for all. We have to show America that. And passing the Justice and Policing Act would be a step toward realizing that goal. Because, colleagues, please understand, tonight and every night, there are Black parents in America and grandparents who will be on their knees praying that their sons and daughters will be safe. Every night in America. We have to take this on, embracing what no doubt are difficult and uncomfortable situations and uncomfortable facts and an uncomfortable history about our country. But we must take this on, understanding this is a righteous demand that we fix this system and that we act. I thank you, my colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you both. Our first panel is Dr. Philip Goff, Franklin A. Thomas Professor in Policing Equity. He'll be by video. Professor Doug Logan, President and Professor of Urban Ministry. The Honorable Melvin Carter, who I'll let Senator Klobuchar introduce in a minute, is on video. Mr. Lee Merritt, attorney of the Merritt Law Firm from Philadelphia. And Ms. Vanta Gupta, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Senator Klobuchar, would you like to say anything about?
I would. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Feinstein, for this hearing. Thank you to my friends, Senator Booker, Senator Harris, for leading this important bill. Before I get to introducing the mayor, I want to note that this murder happened in my state. And George Floyd should be alive today, but he isn't. His life evaporated before our eyes, before the eyes of the world. Our nation has been left in pain. My state has been left in pain, grieving, marching, and demanding justice. This is not a time to just talk about it. If we are silent, we are complicit. If we stand there and demand dominance and wave Bibles, we're no better than monsters. But if we act and we actually do something and get this bill passed, well, then we're lawmakers. And that will be the legacy of George Floyd. So Melvin Carter is the mayor, the first African mayor, American mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota. He represents the best of our state, and like so many Black leaders across the country, he has rose to this occasion. He is a fourth-generation St. Paul resident and comes from a family of public servants. His dad was one of the first Black officers in the St. Paul Police Department, where he served for 28 years, and his mom was the first Black elected as a county commissioner in the state of Minnesota. So it's quite a legacy that he is living up to. After graduating from St. Paul Public Schools and then Florida A&M University and the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, he served as a city council member at a very young age and ultimately became vice chair of the council. During his tenure as mayor, he has given special attention to public safety reform, working to change when and how officers use force, and directing more money to strengthening communities as a way to promote public safety. As we look to and work with local leaders to address the systemic racism that shapes the lives of too many people of color, Mayor Carter is an invaluable voice. I'm grateful for his perspective. I'm proud to have him as a friend and to introduce him to this committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Goff, you'll lead us off.
He's not here.
Is Mr. Goff available?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Graham. Thank you, Ranking Member Feinstein, members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Good afternoon. It is my honor to appear before this committee to provide testimony on police use of force and community relations. You have my full background in my written statement, but for brevity, I'm a behavioral scientist by training. I'm also the inaugural Franklin A. Thomas Professor in Policing Equity at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, but I'm likely best known in police reform circles for my work as co-founder and CEO of the Center for Policing Equity, which is the largest research and action organization focused on equity in policing. My testimony today is in that capacity. Center for Policing Equity maintains the National Science Foundation-funded National Justice Database, which we understand is the largest collection of police behavioral data in the world. Our work focuses on combining police behavioral data with psychological survey data and data from the U.S. Census to estimate not just racial disparities in police outcomes, such as stops and use of force, but the portion of those disparities for which law enforcement are actually responsible and can therefore change. Before I speak specifically about policing, however, I feel compelled to say that what we have seen on the streets of the United States over the recent weeks has been larger than the killing of George Floyd that sparked collective and righteous outrage and is still tearing at the fabric of our democracy. What we are seeing on the streets in the United States is a past due notice for the unpaid debts owed to Black people for 400 plus years. And if the response to this moment as a nation is not proportional to that debt, we will continue to pay it with interest again and again and again. Turning to the complex issue of police reform, I want to spend a moment focusing on what science says about bias in policing. First, there is no doubt that Black, Native, and Latinx people have more contact with law enforcement than do white people in this country. There's also relative agreement that where there are fewer public services like drug treatment, mental health clinics, job training, even parks, law enforcement has more contact with residents. We also know a bit about how race shapes contact with police from the science. This comes to us primarily from two methods of studies, so-called hit rate analyses and regression analyses are the two. Hit rate analyses or yield analyses reveal the percentage of searches that return contraband such as drugs or gun. If the percentage that is yielded is lower for one group than another, the common inference among scientists is that officers are stopping too many from the group which is lower, usually Black people, or that there's a lower threshold of suspicion for that group. This is suggestive of bias, though not conclusive. These types of analyses robustly reveal lower hit rates for Blacks compared to whites across the United States. Regression analyses, in contrast, attempt to predict how much police activity, so stops or use of force, one can expect based on local demographics. In this way, it is possible to assess whether or not crime or poverty or other neighborhood factors are sufficient to explain racial disparities we observe in policing outcomes. This scientific literature demonstrates that neither crime nor poverty are sufficient to explain racial disparities in use of force, and in some limited geographic areas, it's not sufficient to explain racial disparities in stops. So, in summary, there is evidence of racial bias in who is contacted by police and who is targeted for police force. However, it is also the case that clearly not all of the disparities we see are from police policy or behavior alone. I want to clarify, recent attempts to claim that racial bias in policing is a myth have been roundly denounced by serious social scientists, and there is currently a statement signed by more than 500 social scientists denouncing the public spread of this misinformation that's being prepared for public release. I'd be happy to share with this body. So given this understanding of bias in policing, what are we to do? The most recent public debate is between institutional reform and defunding the police. And while there is no quantitative research literature on abolishing policing, there are reasons to believe that many within Black communities are not fully aligned with this vision. Historical and polling research reveal that Black communities do not favor eliminating law enforcement. They mostly want less biased and deadly law enforcement. Though it's important to note that given the degree to which public opinion is evolving on that issue, this too may change, and quickly. But still, to the degree that a path forward involves using police budgets to invest in Black communities, that process must be led by evidence. Evidence about what programs work, both in policing and in communities, and evidence about where cities can safely receive a higher return on their investment in community empowerment. As I mentioned at last week's House Judiciary hearing, the Center for Policing Equity supports the Leadership Conference Comprehensive Framework, and we will work with members of this body and others to ensure that its proposals are ultimately enacted into law. Importantly, this framework enjoys more broad support than civil rights advocates and legislators alone. Many of our partners in law enforcement, chiefs who are experts in public safety, have steadily increased their support for the 8 major pillars of this framework, with many chiefs now in full support of all 8 pillars. While we hope that number will continue to grow, I'd like to mention briefly 2 of those pillars, which most law enforcement have supported since the very beginning of this conversation.
We need to wrap it up. Okay. Go ahead, very quickly.
I'll just say that the ban on chokeholds is not just air blocks, but blood blocks. The registry also involves broad support. And at a time when the nation is so divided, I hope that members of this body will take an opportunity to actually deliver something to the American people. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, sir, very much. Professor Logan. Hit your button there. There you go.
See, I done messed it up. Chairman Graham and Ranking Member Feinstein, Senators, brothers, sisters, and friends. My name is Dr. Doug Logan, Jr. I serve as the president of Grimke Seminary and former pastor of Epiphany Fellowship in Camden, New Jersey. I serve now as a pastor in Richmond, Virginia, at a church called Remnant. I've been asked to talk about the policing and the use of force. And I come to you today not only as a Black man, but also as a Christian clergyman who worked closely with Mayor Dana Red, my friend in the city of Camden, as I don't want to use the word defund, but I'll use revamp, reteam, and retool the police department for more effective policing and a more effective police force in the city of Camden in 2012, 2013, and 2014. I have lived in the inner city for most of my life. Many Americans wouldn't drive through my Camden block after dark or my Patterson block in North Jersey after dark. I speak as someone who has not only observed great injustice, but also experienced them firsthand because of the color of my skin. In spite of all that, however, I speak today not as someone who was filled with rage, but someone who was filled with hope. I am hopeful that we can recover some common ground in this country, starting with a renewed understanding of justice. It must be a vision of justice and equitable treatment of all people who are worthy of dignity, respect, and fairness, having been created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And it must be a vision of justice built on a commitment of all people and their government to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Anything less than this will not provide us with the common ground needed to strive for justice and more than name only, yet I am significantly hopeful. I'm a preacher, so I got 3 points. I pray that we would listen, I pray that we would learn, and then I pray after listening, learning, we would legislate. I pray that we would listen to the cries, the shouts, the screams of Black and brown people and many white people that are screaming on the streets for a new day and a new way and real justice and policies to be put in place. I am hopeful that we can reconnect such a vision of justice to our shared dream for a society that promises liberty and justice for all. It is clear from the cries in the streets that many of our nation's citizens do not feel they have equal access to these realities. In view of America's long history of racial injustice, that seems undoubtedly true. As a man who has grown up under the difficult circumstances of inner city America, I lived among what some would call the urban poor. I have been taught that racism is but one of the many problems facing impoverished minority communities, and anyone who blames everything just on racism, past or present, has failed to consider the complexities of those realities and frailties of the human soul. Yet I am hopeful. I am hopeful that we can restore the proper view of the police in our society and those who have been entrusted by and thus will be held accountable to God, the government, and the people. Theirs is entrusted stewardship, which comes with responsibility and greater accountability, since they are permitted to use force to secure order and to keep the peace, yet without molesting or denying justice in the process. The police force is a necessary public servant to uphold justice in the midst of societal injustices, and should be an agent upholding the good for all people. Towards this end, let us consider the best statistical data wherever it is available to fairly evaluate the rates of police misconduct against minorities. But let us also listen to the stories of the people from the minority communities who almost invariably report statistically unqualifiable instances and bias. Simply put, the facts on the block aren't often recorded in any data. The cries of grandma, grandpa, and my friends and my cousins that we talk about in the barbershop often don't make it to statistical data we can do. So we've listened, we learned. Now I pray that after listening and learning, then we'll legislate. We'll listen to the cries, listen to the pain, listen to the problems, and legislate. If we listen to the people and learn from our cities, I believe we can have comprehensive improvements. I pray for the day for my 3 biracial sons and my Puerto Rican grandkids, that as I was given the talk and told to hold the wheel right and do whatever you have to do to get home. My father told me, do whatever you have to do to get home. The best time to argue with a cop who's mistreating you is a mile down the road while you're alive. So I pray that the talk I'll have with my grandkids and great-grandkids won't be how to survive racist police, but it'll be the talk about in 2020 during a virus and riots that my country, the one I love, came up with wise and radical laws that made them safer. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend, very much. Mayor Carter. Are you there, Mayor?
Yes, I am. Okay. Chair Graham, Ranking Member Feinstein, Minnesota Senators Klobuchar and Smith, and members of the Committee on the Judiciary. My name is Melvin Carter, and I serve as Mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm honored to testify today in support of the justice in policing. My family's been in St. Paul for over 100 years, since my great-grandparents to escape racial violence in the Deep South. My grandfather, Melvin Sr., was a Navy veteran who played his trumpet for 4 U.S. presidents. Working on the railroad, he was denied even the right to his own identity, as all black men were called George, to spare white passengers the hassle of learning their names. George Floyd's murder is so personal because every black teacher, electrician, and mayor knows that we are all George, and no matter no amount of money or accomplishments can change that fact. My father, Melvin Jr., served 28 years as a St. Paul officer and sergeant after a court order integrated our department. Because of that integration order, my friends and I grew up surrounded by superhero officers from our own neighborhood who knew us by name, were invested in our future, and who solved problems in ways that no one else could. Still, I grew up with a set of rules that did not apply to my white classmates. They could drive a decent vehicle, visit the mall, or glance into a passing squad without fear of being stopped and questioned by police. I could not. Research shows that people who trust law enforcement will treat them fairly, are more likely to cooperate with officers, arrest, and step forward as a witness. Any of us distrust police, all of us are less safe. It's time we challenge the myth of public safety as a simple function of police, prisons, and prosecutors. We spend nearly $200 billion annually on law enforcement and corrections and maintain the highest imprisonment rate on the planet. Yet despite 3 decades of steady public safety spending increases, Americans feel less safe every year. The reason is clear. Our country's enforcement-heavy public safety strategies aren't designed to address the causes of crime, but the symptoms. We deserve more than a swift response after a crime is committed. We deserve investment to reduce the number of times we have to call police in the first place. And we deserve to know that our officers will protect and serve all of us. We've spent the last few years walking this talk and set walk. We've rewritten policies governing use of force in police dogs and terminated 5 officers who willfully failed to stop an assault in progress. We embedded social workers to respond with officers to individual crisis, employed restorative justice circles for nonviolent offenders, and focused capital investments to drive safety goals. Last year, we reduced our police department's authorized sprint in favor of evidence-based investments in youth, social supports, and a public health approach to violence prevention. Mayors are leading with reforms like these across the country, but we need your help. We fire problem officers only to see them shielded from accountability, reinstated through arbitration, and hired by agencies unaware of their past. We build trust with residents only to see those relationships damaged again and again by footage from other jurisdictions. With the Justice in Policing Act of 2020, we can establish a national standard of policing to curb brutality, end racial profiling, and eliminate qualified immunity. We can invest in community policing programs and alternatives for safety beyond policing. We can prevent officers from switching departments to avoid accountability and send a strong message to our children and to the world that America will no longer accept these cycles of violence against our Black and brown. I know you will be pressured by powerful friends who will paint these reforms as hostile to police, but our work to restore confidence is a lifeline for officers who serve in good faith. When someone argues that these measures go too far, and they will, remember Officer Chauvin knelt on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That's longer than my allotted time to make this statement. To prevent that from happening to another we care about, no response will qualify as too much. Just as we grew up wanting to know where our parents stood in critical moments like Pearl Harbor and Freedom Summer, our children and grandchildren will call us to account for our actions now. Simply measuring the problems and offering incentives will not suffice. This moment demands decisive action. Like Emmett Till, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Ahmaud Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and too many others, George Floyd commands the attention of the world because of the unacceptable conditions under which he died. The anger and unrest across our country will grow until we address the unacceptable conditions like homelessness, hunger, and police abuse, under which far too many Americans still live. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Merritt.
Senator Graham, other members of this honorable committee, we live in the deadliest police culture and most incarceration-prone police culture in the modern world. Our criminal justice and legal system is as ravenous as it is racist. Our law enforcement community racks up thousands of civilian deaths each year. Tens of thousands more are brutalized, injured, and maimed. Millions more are arrested and jailed, making the United States the single most incarcerated nation in the entire history of the world. This is an American crisis, a genocide. This is not hyperbole, but rather a reality that demands a national response, and I want to thank this committee for taking immediate, swift, and responsive action. I come before you today as a civil rights attorney, a practitioner. I am the legal director for the Grassroots Law Project, and I represent families of citizens killed by police. Some of the names you know, far too many you have not heard. I represent the family of Ahmaud Arbery, who was murdered by a former police officer, Gregory McMichael, his son, Travis McMichael, and their neighbor, William Bryan. While I'm here to provide testimony about justice in policing, and Ahmaud Arbery was not killed in an officer-involved shooting, it was failures in policing that directly contributed to his death and the delay of justice to his family. Neighbors initially sought help for the black jogger that frequented their neighborhood that they considered suspicious from Officer Ronald Rash of the Glenn County Police Department. He encouraged them to pursue a course of vigilantism. He was aware for months that these men were actively hunting a black suspect to whom they intended to do harm. Once the deed was done, it was law enforcement that lied to Wanda Cooper Jones, Ahmaud's mother, telling her that her son had been killed in the course of a robbery by the homeowner. Local DAs Jackie Johnson and George Barnhill participated in the cover-up of his shooting. The Gunn County Police Chief, where this crime occurred, was subsequently arrested on completely separate criminal corruption allegations, along with a handful of his top officials. Ahmaud's story is not just tragic and unjust, it lays bare the need for a reimagining of police in America and their mission in our society. I run a practice dedicated exclusively to responding to police murders. I'm one of many attorneys that has this crisis at the root of their firm as this nation churns out enough bodies and human rights violations to keep us all occupied for a very long time. I continue to stand for the family of George Floyd. Derek Chauvin and other officers of the Minneapolis Police Department held him down for 8 minutes and 46 seconds under the unbearable weight of oppression. He could not breathe, and as the nation looked on in horror, we could not breathe. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellis and Minnesota's top law enforcement official preemptively declared that this would be a case difficult to prosecute. As hard as that is to accept, given the evidence we have now seen with our own eyes, it is consistent with the American experience. Because of existing laws that basically give carte blanche to law enforcement to kill at will with the utterance of these five words, I feared for my life. Hard-fought, rare prosecutions and difficult convictions have characterized the experiences of families like Botham Jean. He was killed in his apartment complex eating a bowl of ice cream. His killer, Amber Geiger, said that she was instructed, that she was trained, that if you can't see the suspect's hands, shoot him. Tatiana Jefferson, also gunned down in her own home after leaving the door open to catch a cool breeze of relief from the heat of the night in Fort Worth, Texas. Fort Worth police officer Erin Dean crept around the back curtilage of her home, saw her standing in the window and shot her through the bedroom as she played video games with her nephew. The beautiful families that I've traveled with represent a cross-section of America. Disproportionately black, undeniably strong, relentlessly committed to the cause of justice and policing. They include the father of a young woman named Maggie Brooks. Her father is a fire chief in Arlington, Texas. His daughter was accidentally shot by a police officer who recklessly shot at her 6-month-old puppy, but struck Ms. Brooks instead, killing her. Qualified immunity has banned her family access to the court. Under the current federal laws, there will be no criminal or civil liability for this officer or his department. They include the family of Michael Dean, who went out to get his 6-year-old daughter a birthday cake and never made it home. I wish I could tell you what happened to Michael Dean, but the video has still not been released by the department, although the officer has been indicted on manslaughter charges. This family has still not been allowed to see the body or dash cam evidence of what happened to their loved one. They have been denied access to these videos by the city of Temple, Texas, and Bell County District Attorney Henry Garza. Cameron Lamb of Kansas City, Missouri, was unarmed and shot in his place of business and his home. The chief of police in Kansas City, Missouri, has broken with the local district attorney and refused to submit a probable cause affidavit in the case, making prosecution very difficult. Jamel Roberson was a hero from Chicago. He was working as a security guard at a nightclub when the nation was hobbling from one mass shooting to another. A gunman entered his club and began shooting indiscriminately at patrons. Jamel sprang into action, disarming him, and he waited for police to arrive. When responding officer Ian Covey arrived and when told that the suspect was being held around the corner, he quickly went to the scene and shot Jamel Roberson in his back 3 times, killing him. There has been no accountability in that case. Antoine Rose was a 17-year-old, unarmed, when he ran from a traffic stop.
If you could wrap it up, please. Thank you. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, looking at the clock, it says I have one. I'm sorry, am I over?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
That's all right. Just take your time. Wrap it up.
Yes, sir. Antoine Rose was 17 when he ran from a traffic stop. The officer who killed him had just been sworn in the department that day after transferring from another jurisdiction under concerns of racism and brutality. The question we must ask We must be the generation to answer is, what are we going to do about all of this? Will future generations look back at this moment with pride that we confronted our greatest evils with real courage, or will they be disappointed because we had a moment to make change possible and failed? Right now, that answer still hangs in the balance. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. Ms. Gupta.
Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Feinstein, members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today on the need for transformative policing policies that promote accountability and respect the dignity of all people. And Senators Brooker and Harris, thank you so much for your leadership and for the Justice in Policing Act. While the recent murders of Rayshard Brooks, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd at the hands of police officers have once again put the issue of police brutality in the national spotlight, the outpouring of pain and anger is anything but a reaction to isolated incidents or the misconduct of a few bad apples. Instead, the outcry is a response to the long history of violence with impunity toward Black people in our nation. And as law enforcement leaders themselves have acknowledged, from early slave patrols to the modern-day criminalization of people of color, policing has involved the enforcement of unjust laws and helped maintain structural racism in too many communities in this country. We are now at a turning point, and there really is no return to normal. We have to create a new way forward, one that truly transforms policing and leads to more accountability for communities. It is imperative that we get this right, and that Congress's response in this moment appropriately reflects and acknowledges the important work of Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black lives that has brought us to where we are today. My tenure as head of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division began just 2 months after 18-year-old Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, by a police officer. And the Justice Department was hardly perfect, but we understood our mandate, which was to promote accountability and constitutional policing in order to build community trust. During the Obama administration, we opened 25 patterns of practice investigations to help realize greater structural and community-centered change, often at the request of police chiefs and mayors from around the country. And after making findings, we negotiated consent decrees with extensive stakeholder engagement to overhaul unlawful policing practices and develop sustainable mechanisms for accountability. Police departments around the country studied these consent decrees. They studied President Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force report to advance best practices. That is not the Justice Department that we have today. Under both Attorneys General Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr, the department has abdicated its responsibility and abandoned the use of tools like pattern of practice investigations and consent decrees. The disruption of crucial work of the Civil Rights Division and throughout the Department of Justice to bring forth accountability and transparency in policing is deeply concerning. In the absence of federal leadership, the Leadership Conference Education Fund launched the New Era of Public Safety Initiative with a comprehensive guide to support local communities on police reform and building community police trust. While a lot of these changes have to happen at the state and local level, success is going to require leadership, support, and commitment of the federal government, including Congress. On June 1st, the Leadership Conference and more than 450 civil rights organizations sent a letter to Congress offering critical recommendations to move us forward on the path to true accountability. They included creating a national standard on the use of force, prohibiting racial profiling and requiring robust data collection, banning the use of chokeholds and other maneuvers that cut off blood and oxygen, ending the militarization of policing, prohibiting the use of no-knock warrants, especially in drug cases, strengthening federal accountability systems and increasing the Justice Department's authority to prosecute officers under the color of law, creating a national police misconduct registry, and ending qualified immunity. These comprehensive measures are reflected in the Justice and Policing Act. They are necessary for police accountability. Proposals for data collection, commissions, body cameras, these are insufficient responses to meet the moment that we find ourselves in, and more people will die. Where we have seen these kinds of nibbling at the edges policies implemented, we continue to grapple with police officers killing African Americans with impunity. Police accountability and the framework that our coalition outlined must be the cornerstone of any meaningful first steps towards transformation. Ultimately, however, this moment of reckoning really requires more than tinkering at the edges. It requires leaders together with communities from both parties to envision a new paradigm of public safety. That means not just changing policing practices and culture, but ultimately shrinking the footprint of the criminal legal system, including police in Black and brown people's lives. And it means shifting our approach to public safety away from exclusive investments in criminalization and policing toward investments in economic opportunity, health, education, and other public benefits. I have heard police chiefs, police officers, bipartisan elected leaders, and communities that have all been giving voice to these issues. This approach not only furthers equity, but also constitutes effective policy. When we finally stop using criminal justice policy as social policy, we will make communities safer and prosperous. George Floyd's death has impacted the world, and now it is on us to change it. I look forward to working with you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Logan.
Yes, sir, Chairman.
Has it been the talk, for lack of a better word, if the police officer getting out of the car is African American or a woman, does it change the equation?
I'm a little older. I'm closer to Senator Booker's age. I'm almost 50 from Paterson, New Jersey. So
that's not old here. Yeah.
I guess in my history, I was mainly growing up in New Jersey. I was pulled over mainly by white officers. So I imagine I was pulled over recently.
Well, the point of the question is if policing is more like the community, do you think that helps the recruiting of minority officers and women?
Yeah. Senator, I would say that in Camden, we had the officers walk around, talk to us, meet us, get to know us. And it was a very diverse police force as we shifted to the county. And that meant a whole lot.
Do you think that means as much as hiring minority officers?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. So those minority officers were vital.
It's how you do it as much as who you are.
Amen. Okay. Amen. Because
right.
you could have a...
I got you.
I
got you. Yeah. I know you're a preacher. I got to move on. I don't know. All right. So, Mayor Carter, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Do you have the same problems in St. Paul they have in Minneapolis?
Mr. Chair, I would say...
With policing, yeah.
Mr. Chair, I would say to narrow this issue down to one department or a few bad apples, as we recently heard some folks on the national level, I think would be to misunderstand.
Well, I mean, you're literally side by side. And my question, Mayor, is what have you done in St. Paul they haven't done in Minneapolis?
I wouldn't try to speak to Minneapolis. What I'd say is we have been intentional to your last question about hiring our diverse officers. Our last class of officers was 77% diverse. We have had, I think, strong and consistent leadership in our department. That's critical. But I would also tell you, we are not done correcting this culture. It's work that our police chief is always focused on. It's work that we know that we have to do as a community together. And I think it's work that requires us to do this, to approach this at a national level, not just a department.
Okay. Ms. Gupta, during the 8 years of President Obama, was there an effort to get rid of qualified immunity for police officers?
There were conversations in many corners.
I'm not talking about conversations. Was there any legislation?
There was not legislation.
Was there any legislation to outlaw no-knock warrants?
Not to my knowledge.
Was there any legislation to create a national registry for violent acts by the police?
There were efforts to create the national registry, and all of these things were included in the 21st Century Policing.
Well, I just missed a lot of that. So, you know, this is a tough time for the country. And Trump's a handful, but we're not here because of failings of one administration. We're here because of failing of society. And most of the things we want to do now could have been done 8 years ago. So let's do the things now that make sense. Yes, sir. Let's do the things now that we should have done 50 years ago. Now, I come from South Carolina. Tim and I have completely different experiences with the cops. There is no getting around that. And it is now time to have an honest conversation about why is that? How can it be that if you're a United States Senator from South Carolina and you're black, you get stopped 5 or 6 times, and you're white, you never get stopped? How can it be that people die because of a $20 bill who are in custody not threatening anybody? And here's what I worry about the most. It is hard to be a cop. Let's make sure that we don't destroy the ability to be a cop in the process of trying to fix things that need to be fixed. Qualified immunity is an intriguing idea to me. I don't want the cop to lose their house, but I do want people to have to think twice if they've got a police force about how to organize it and how to train it. Because that's when change will happen. It's when people feel the sting of bad policies. So to the extent that any of you on this side, on my Democratic colleagues, want to get there, count me in. There are a bunch of us who would like to get there. And if we get there, it'll be together. And I look forward to the discussion. And this will be the first of several hearings about what getting there looks like. Senator Feinstein.
Chairman, it seems to me that the chokehold should be banned from detention use, except in certain life or death circumstances. And apparently a growing number of state and local law enforcement agencies are banning the use of chokeholds. For example, as I understand it, Los Angeles Police Department recently directed its officers not to use chokeholds that restrict blood flow to the brain, also known as carotid restraints. So I think we should deal with it in this Justice and Policing Act. And I'd like to know each of your opinions. If there were a ban, do you believe there should be any exception to this ban? For example, an exception where lethal force is being used against an officer or someone else? If not, why not? Could we go right down the row and have everybody answer that, please?
Yes.
Could you turn on your mic?
I'm going to figure that out today.
Right.
Yes, I would be absolutely for no more chokeholds. I would lean into the best brains and the best minds on when lethal force. I've been told that, once there's engagement between the person, between the citizen and the officer, that's where we get the challenge. So I would be opposed to chokeholds,
okay.
Period.
Could we go down the road and down the line, and could someone respond to life or death circumstances as one exception too, please?
Sure. Lee Merritt, I would be obviously in favor of banning the chokehold, except for when deadly force is authorized, is in fact authorized under the law. And then it seems like that would be an appropriate time to use whatever means it takes to survive the encounter, both from a law enforcement perspective. However, I believe that of the myriad of ways that law enforcement engages in violence in this community, we should really be focusing on changing the mission in terms of whether or not these violent encounters should be taking place at all, whether law enforcement officers should be engaged in a war on drugs, per se, that leads to repeated violent encounters.
Thank you.
Senator, yeah, chokeholds are inherently dangerous maneuvers. They've been banned, as you noted, in jurisdictions including New York, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and Miami. And to Senator Graham's point, I do wish the Justice and Policing Act had been proposed several years ago. These are longstanding problems, and the moment to make these fixes is now.
Next question, if I may. In a simple way for a non-lawyer audience, how does qualified immunity work? Why is it a problem? And what happens if Congress eliminates the defense of qualified immunity?
If I may, qualified immunity essentially says that if an officer in good faith believed that what he was doing was in line with his roles and responsibilities as a police officer, even if he reasonably believes that, even if it turns out factually to be wrong, then he is immune not only from conviction, but he's immune from suit. There's no discovery. There's no continuation of either a civil or a criminal process.
So what do you believe there?
What do I believe?
Yes. Should that be changed?
Right. So if you take the example of the case I brought up during my opening, the case of Margarita Brooks, the officer in good faith thought he was shooting at a dog. It was reckless behavior, something that he should not have been engaged in, but he thought that he was protecting himself from a 6-month-old puppy that was charging at him. And in the process, he killed a woman. Should he or his department be immune from suit? Absolutely not. He should be held accountable for his reckless behavior and the damage that it caused.
Thank you. Next.
Yes, I believe that that's a part of the transparency and accountability, and also prayerfully will serve as a deterrent and hold the officers at a higher accountability when there will be repercussions. If without that, then the culture comprehensively will have a feel of, I can do what I want and I can get away with it.
I would like to ask the panel quickly if you could reflect on the use of a no-knock warrant and the impact that that would have on communities of color, particularly those with strained relations with the police.
Well, Breonna Taylor was killed pursuant to a no-knock warrant. She was asleep in her house. There has been a lot of very high-profile tragedies as a result of no-knock warrants, overused in drug cases in particular, and their list is long, and I'd be happy to supply the committee with some of those cases, but it is time now to regulate them.
Thank you. Please, sir.
Yes. No, we believe that no-knock warrants should be absolutely banned. There is a preference within before the Supreme Court in favor of protecting citizens' rights in their home, the home being one of the most sacred places. The idea that a no-knock warrant, like in the case of Breonna Taylor, or the entry of the home of a Tatiana Jefferson, or the entry of the home of Botham Jean, or some of the other cases that I spoke about during my opening, to allow law enforcement to violate a citizen's rights in that way when they are still yet suspects of a crime, people who have not been convicted of a crime, we don't believe that that would be ever appropriate.
Thank you. Please, sir.
And I would align myself with both my colleagues and say no. Yes, no-knock warrants. It has a tone of guilty until proven innocent. And as a homeowner, as a father, as a husband, if I respond wrong, I could be dead. And Breonna Taylor is a testimony that we should ban no-knock warrants.
Thank you.
Senator Grassley.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry. I'd like to, first of all, thank you, Chairman Graham, for the hearing. The murder of George Floyd by police officers, a police officer, ignited the call for reform and measures to rectify a lingering racism that plagues our country. To Mr. Merritt here and to the Floyd family not here, please know that the grief and shock that we feel, that it will fuel action to prevent more tragic and unnecessary deaths. While the vast majority of law enforcement officers are public servants to deserve support and respect, George Floyd's murder shows we're not nearly doing enough to prevent abuse by police. I welcome tough conversation. I built a legislative and oversight career of rooting out instances where accountability is needed and where abuses must end. I led on the First Step Act to rectify shortcomings of our criminal justice system, which we know impacts disproportionately minority men and women. I investigated the 2017 shooting of Bijan Gazer, which revealed instances of poor de-escalation tactics and inappropriate aggressive use of force. We must come together and address deadly use of force, racial biases, and police abuse, and do it now. My first question is to Dr. Goff, and while he's coming on, I'll lead in with this. I've long supported efforts to increase transparency and accountability of all government actors. Police officers are no different. That's why I've co-sponsored Senator Tim Scott's bill, which would increase transparency by the use of force, by requiring reports where there's been death or serious injury because just a minority of jurisdictions are reporting that. So my first question to you, sir, is I assume that this data would be helpful in understanding how to prevent unnecessary use of force. If you disagree with that, say so, but I assume that might be. So if so, how can increased transparency into incidents of deadly or unnecessary use of force help protect members of the community as well as police officers?
Thank you for the question, Senator Grassley. Your assumption is correct. If we collected those data nationally, that could be absolutely useful to preventing those kinds of tragedies going forward. But just as important is collecting the information where deadly force could have been used but wasn't. Because to do the right kind of analyses, what you need to know is a lot about the universe where force could be used. Those are the data that have been historically missing, and that's part of the reason why the analyses have been so inconclusive. So I would want to focus the committee's attention not just on what data are collected, but how we get the right kind of analyses, because the analyses are ultimately what's going to inform decision making.
Okay, thank you. Now to Mayor Carter and also Dr. Goff. Police officers should be seen not just as enforcers of the law, but as neighbors and members of the community. However, many cops don't live in the area they patrol, so a natural divide and mistrust can form. To you two, I'll start with Mayor Carter. How can we encourage more engagement and trust between police officers and those they patrol?
Senator Grassley, that's an important question, and I really appreciate it. I heard a conversation earlier about what the officers look like. I think that's a part of the conversation. But much more importantly, I think what you're getting at is officers who are integrated into the community, who know our community as well. It's not just about hiring an officer and getting to people to understand it. It's about people who are a part of the community in the first place. My father always says, if you know a community, if you know it very well, and you go to your children go to school there, you can come up with a whole lot of ways or reasons not to shoot someone. And I think that's very important. We have a number of examples of ways that departments across the country are trying to identify people. We have the Police Explorers Program, a law enforcement career pathways academy that's designed to take young people out of high schools, out of our local neighborhoods, and make police officers more funding for things like that, more funding incentives for officers to live in the community would help.
Okay, and I'll yield after Dr. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I interrupt him? Dr. Goff, your answer, and then I'll have to yield to the next questioner.
No, so absolutely, it can be useful for the community to see themselves reflected in their law enforcement protectors. I would also say, though, the focus, to the degree that we can keep there, should be on law enforcement culture, not just on policies. Giving law enforcement the tools to make sure that the people who advance and the people who get fired, the people who get hired, reflect the cultural values of protecting the community and investing in community empowerment and voice, rather than just sets of policies which may or may not get fired. Culture eats policies for breakfast, and we do well to remember that as we revise our interventions.
Thank you. Senator Leahy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this hearing, but I especially appreciate the testimony we've heard. Now, I'm going to ask Ms. Gupta a question in an area that she's well familiar with. We've seen the proven track record pattern or practice investigations, what it can do. But despite the proven track record of reducing police shootings, the Justice Department, the Trump Justice Department, has effectively abandoned pattern or practice investigations and the use of consent decrees. I think it was 14, if I'm correct, consent decrees were enforced under the Obama administration. I don't believe a single one has been enforced under President Trump. So my question to you, Ms. Gupta, you are a former head of the Justice Department Civil Rights Division. How do pattern or practice investigation and consent decrees make a difference in changing police practices?
Well, the Justice Department, in a nation with 18,000 police departments, use this tool pretty judiciously, but would conduct an investigation after being made aware of systemic problems in a police department. These investigations often were anywhere between 6 months to a year. Very deep investigations involving interviews with hundreds and hundreds of community residents, hundreds and hundreds of police officers, police leadership, looking at all kinds of data, doing statistical analysis and the like, looking at training, accountability, supervision. And if their Justice Department made a finding of systemic unconstitutional policing problems in a jurisdiction, it would produce a report, make public the findings of this report, and begin to negotiate a consent decree. On rare occasions, it would involve litigation, but in most instances, the jurisdiction, the city, would settle and produce a far-yielding document that would allow, because it would be filed with a federal judge, allow for politics to be taken out and long-term sustainable change over the course of whatever political administrations may come and go.
And that's the reason I asked the question. Does it send a message if you don't use these tools, if you have documented police misconduct? Doesn't that say, well, we're just going to close our eye to it?
Yeah, I think it has sent a very dangerous signal for the Justice Department to have shut this work down. I think it creates more of a culture of impunity in a sense that there isn't a kind of a watchdog agency that has been historically, through Republican and Democratic administrations, played a really important role in ensuring constitutional.
Well, and the reason I asked the question, I don't think of Vermont as being a microcosm of the country, but I've never heard such across the political spectrum the kind of concerns I've heard it's happening. And then in the hundreds and thousands of emails I get from around the country, people say this movement is simply not going to go away after some time, as others have. I hope they're right. What would you tell members of Congress who think we can just wait and see?
This waiting and seeing will mean more people will die. And
Thank you.
And I think it will undermine any sense that we have a legal system that is legitimate and fair in people's eyes, and ultimately that undermines public safety.
Well, I happen to agree with you, and it's we have to keep talking about it. I have a question for Mr. Merritt on, with any other civil rights issue, legal protections against police brutality will only be meaningful if they can be enforced in a court of law. I'm a lawyer. I was a prosecutor. I was a trial lawyer. Many who oppose making changes to the qualified immunity doctrine. And it's been pretty evident it's prevented victims of even horrific police brutality from getting redress in court. They argue that it's going to open excess litigation and prosecution of police officers. How do you respond to that, Mr. Merritt?
First, I'll say that we've done a review of case law in the area, and there are several officers over an expansive period of time that have been granted qualified immunity for applying a knee to someone's body and them expiring during the course of that. In other words, Derek Chauvin is ripe to benefit from the protections of qualified.
In other words, using the knee to kill somebody.
That's correct.
Okay.
Stated plainly, using the knee to kill somebody is the kind of thing that gets you qualified immunity in America. The scary thing is, the concern is that if you remove qualified immunity, you flood the courts with cases of officers killing people. Most nations don't kill that many people that's a legitimate concern. Only in America is that a problem. So the answer, of course, to the question is stop killing so many people.
Thank you. You said what was on my mind. I have other questions. Can I submit them for the
Absolutely. Senator Cornyn.
And I thank all the witnesses.
Thank you. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask the witnesses to tell us if they believe that the police department and the police in America are systemically racist. Does anybody, would anybody like to raise their hand agreeing with that statement? Mr. Merritt? I'm sorry, Professor
Logan.
Professor Logan, I can't see that far away. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
So we got two that think this is systemic, and that means all 18,000 police departments, all 800,000 law enforcement officers. Is that your view?
I think if you couch it in the system and not meet, I don't know all 18,000, but the system in and of itself has systemic racism.
I'm sorry, if I may, Senator, the reason that I've observed that all police in America isn't brought in a systematic racism is because their mission is bad. We empower our police to go over police inner city communities, to go in there and find drugs and guns and punish wrongdoers. The issue is the problems in the inner city community are blight or poverty or sickness or homelessness. Those aren't situations that are necessarily remedied by a man with a gun, but rather the appropriate social workers, for example, or healthcare workers that would remedy the problem. When we over-concentrate our communities, with black and brown communities specifically, with militarized policing, what you're going to have is disproportionate use of force and incarceration of black and brown people.
Well, Mr. Merritt, to the extent that you are suggesting that we're asking our law enforcement officials to do more than just enforce the law, to be social workers, mental health providers, and the like. I think Chief Brown, formerly of the Dallas Police Department, said we ask our police to do too much, and that's probably true in my view. A number of jurisdictions have experimented successfully with a team approach. For example, to try to reduce or de-escalate the confrontation when it comes to people with mental illness or the like. And certainly, I think all of us see the benefit of de-escalation training. But to what extent is the problem that we have with excessive use of force and lack of trust with the police a matter of class as opposed to race? In other words, it doesn't depend on the color of your skin, but whether you're poor or lack opportunities in our society.
Senator Corden, in the United States of America, it's a little difficult to disentangle those two, and I don't think there's an institution in this country that isn't suffering from structural racism given our history. I think the goal of taking action in this moment is to recognize that there are things that Congress can do to end the killings in our streets, to provide law enforcement with greater training, support, to make national standards on things that, frankly, should have been national standards years ago. This is the time to take action, given the pain on the streets and in communities, and this is just the reality of what communities have been experiencing. But there
Ms. Gupta, I don't have very long to ask questions, so let me ask you. You changed the phrase from systemic to structural racism. What does that mean? That means everything, every institution, every person in America is a racist?
It means that there is bias built into existing institutions. And the policing, there have been any number of courageous police chiefs that have spoken to the history of systemic racism in policing as well.
Do you think systemic or structural racism can exist in a system that requires individual responsibility? Or do you think it's one or the other?
I think every American institution has been kind of shaped by these forces, and our goal is to do what we can as policymakers, as advocates, to take that out and to provide and to try to fight it in the modern day iterations that it appears.
Well, do you believe that basically all Americans are racist?
I think we all have implicit bias and racial bias. Yes, I do.
Wow.
And I think that we are an amazing country that strives to be better every single day. It's why I went to government, to make a more perfect union.
Well, you lost me when you want to take the acts of a few misguided, perhaps malicious individuals and ascribe that to all Americans, not just our 800,000 police officers, our 18,000 police departments. I think, thank you for your answer.
Somebody has their mic on. Could you please mute it from the remote locations, I think? Okay, Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Let me respond to Senator Cornyn's question, because I think what we find, Senator Cornyn, is that...
I didn't ask you a question.
Well, I think you asked them a question which I would like to try to answer. If you take a look at our system of justice and start with the premise that when it comes to drug users, there's an equal percentage of white and black drug users. Now you look at the number arrested for the use of drugs, it turns out more blacks than whites. The number convicted, the number prosecuted, the number incarcerated, dramatically larger among the African American population. There's something built into our system that doesn't equate actual criminal conduct or criminal disposition towards the penalties that we assess.
And my only suggestion is that could well be a function of poverty as opposed to color.
How it starts, I'm not sure, but I can tell you at the end of the system, the result is the same. Can I mention two other issues, if I can, that the chairman has raised, and I'd like for him to consider this. Back in the day, before I was elected to Congress, I was defending the sheriff of a rural county in Illinois, and he was being sued for the mistreatment of a prisoner in jail. How did I end up defending him? Not because I was the state's attorney, not because I was in public office, but because I worked for an insurance company. And it turned out that DeWitt County, Illinois, had an insurance policy that covered the sheriff. So when the sheriff was sued for wrongdoing as the sheriff, ultimately the county, DeWitt County, stepped in and indemnified him for any liability he might have. So it turns out, Mr. Chairman, that in 99 to 100% of these cases against the wrongdoing of an individual officer, there is an employer who steps in and provides an insurance policy and coverage that pays whatever needs to be paid. And I will tell you, as a former trial lawyer, I didn't go after motorcycles of defendants. I was looking for their insurance policies. So I think the personal liability issue which you raised is covered by the fact that 99 to 100% of these cases involve insurance policies. But they never get to the question of liability because they can't get around the basic issue of qualified immunity. They can't match up on all fours misconduct with something that's already been tried. Mr. Merritt, has that been your experience?
That has.
So I would just answer your question, Mr. Chairman. Yes, those who are guilty of wrongdoing should be held on a civil basis for their wrongdoing. And no, it would not mean that their homes would be taken away from their wives in that regard. Can I ask this question, if I might? We've talked a lot about the conduct of those who are in law enforcement. And I recently had a roundtable last Friday in Chicago, and a representative of the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Now, we all know that mental illness is part of this conversation. And what we found was kind of an eye-opener from the viewpoint of law enforcement officers. The highest incidence of suicide among any profession in America are men and women in law enforcement. And they have 5 times as frequently PTSD and depression. It appears that there are some issues with their lifestyle, their job, the availability of weapons, the stress they go through, that create a very vulnerable population among law enforcement officials. I believe we need to address, and I'm happy to co-sponsor this legislation of Senators Booker and Harris and others, I believe we need to address that side of the equation. I believe there's been, and we've seen it in videotape and proven it with DNA, there has been racism and unfairness in our administration of justice. But we also try to address, at least in parts of this bill, the training of those who are in law enforcement, to try to find those who are not stable, those who are not fair, those who are too biased, and those who shouldn't have a badge and a gun. And so let me just address that for a moment. Ms. Gupta, would you like to address that issue? It strikes me that we've got to consider that aspect of it if we want a police force in the future that we can count on not to repeat what the sins of the past.
Yeah, I mean, on these issues, the Justice Department consent decrees always had provisions on officer wellness, and because the mental health issues among police officers was a big concern around accountability issues, discipline issues, and the like, and that was built into these consent decrees because they had to be taken seriously. And the other issue that you just mentioned around de-escalation, use of force, different training, bringing mental health teams in so that mental health professionals were paired with police officers when arriving on the scene, with people in mental health crisis was another thing that was a really common theme. But both of these issues around mental health and policing were really important.
The last point I'll make is questions have been raised. Why, when the one officer with his knee on the neck of that poor man, literally killing him, was engaged in that conduct while he was, I believe he had shackled, he had cuffs on at some point, so he was no visible threat. What were the other three officers doing? Why wasn't there some attempt at intervention? And some have explained to me that because there's a military structure to our police that the chain of command makes peer intervention difficult, if not impossible. And I think we have to address that when we talk about policing in the future.
Thank you. Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We all know that about the brutal and senseless killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. There's no excuse, nor can there be, for what the police did to Mr. Floyd. His killers, fortunately, are being brought to justice. His death, we hope, will not be remembered solely for being the senseless act of violence that falsely was launched in his name, but rather, hopefully, his memory will be made permanent in our national consciousness, in the long-term reform of policing policies across our country. In my home state of Utah, the city of Ogden is still mourning over another death, that of police officer Nate Lyday. On May 28th, a woman called 911 saying that her husband was threatening her life. Lyday and a group of officers arrived promptly at the home. The man inside the home began shooting at them from inside. Lyday was mortally wounded. Officer Lyday was only 24 years old. He was about to celebrate his 5th wedding anniversary to his wife, Ashley. He had been on the job as a police officer for just 15 months. By all accounts, Officer Lyday did his job honorably and completely, very much up until the moment he drew his last breath after being mortally wounded on the job. Nate Lyday was an officer who sought to uphold justice and protect the innocent, even making the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of a threatened and fearful family. Nate Lyday's loss really is our loss. It's a loss for everyone. George Floyd's loss is also our loss. It's a loss for everyone as well. And we ought to remember and revere them both. I think we can do precisely that. And the residents of Ogden, Utah are a good example of how that can happen. They came together for a peaceful protest in order to draw attention to both of these tragic deaths. This was a protest that ended and started peacefully and brought members of the Ogden community together rather than pulling them apart. So this is an important issue. It's one that we've got to continue to focus on. In 2012 in Camden, New Jersey, Camden, New Jersey had the highest rate of crime in the entire nation, as I understand it. In addition to rampant crime, the police department in Camden, New Jersey discovered extensive corruption among the police force, with officers routinely planting evidence on suspects, fabricating reports, and in many circumstances committing perjury. This behavior was so pervasive that a total of 88 convictions had to be reversed as a result of it. And as a result of this fallout, the governor and the mayor decided to disband the Camden, New Jersey police force and transferred the policing of the city over to the county. Now, notably, the rebuilding of this new Metro Police Department moved forward without the involvement of a number of people who had previously been involved in it, including the police union. Officers from the disbanded Camden Police Department were invited to apply for the new police force, and over 100 of them, a little less than half as far as we can tell, were eventually rehired. But as a result of this restructuring, response times improved. Now a person waiting for a police responder waits, I'm told, an average of 4.4 minutes, instead of the previous average, which I'm told was over 60 minutes. Violent crimes in Camden have dropped 42% in just 7 years. All of this was done without a union. And in fact, all of this was done by freeing the department from a collective bargaining agreement that, as it's been explained to me, had previously locked the city and the city's police department into an unholy alliance with some officers who had violent and, in many cases, lawless tendencies. And so this brought about what, by all outwardly observable metrics, seemed to be a better set of circumstances. So, Mr. Logan, I want to thank you for being here and for your healing words. I appreciate your account of the progress that's been made in Camden. And in your written testimony, you mentioned the difficult balance that has to be struck in order to empower police officers to do their difficult work, while also holding accountable those who disregard the justice that they're entrusted to uphold. In your view, did this restructuring that happened in Camden, tell me about how it helped to recalibrate that balance between power and authority that you mentioned?
Thank you, Senator. I would say that they listened to the people, from town hall meetings to conversations. Once what we're doing here, they begin to hear from regular residents. And I remember Governor Christie came to a hall near my house and had several clergymen and regular residents speak into their struggles, their challenges, their fears, and the issues of Camden in its broken state. And Mayor Red just did a great job of hearing and almost re-saying to make sure that we were heard. And from that, as the new officers, again, the community policing, as they walk the streets, as a preacher, I'm good for a block party and an impromptu cookout. I never forget, I was cooking on the corner, and one of the officers, everybody called me Pastor Diddy. So he said, Pastor Diddy, man, I'm going to go get some more hot dogs because we're out. This officer goes and gets hot dogs and comes back, and he's electric sliding on the block. That would have never happened in Camden. That connection, that relationship now, if that officer was to pull over somebody, it changes the whole story. And so that accountability was a big, that relationship created the accountability that also was put in place, because now a big thing that happened in Camden is we didn't know half the officials. So their faces were very visible and conversations were constantly happening. And therefore, and we had the baseball cards with the police officers. All those type of things built into our connection, our relationship, which allowed for a level of trust. And in 10 seconds, I got pulled over in front of my house at a cookout, coming back with some more food. And one of the officers was talking a little rough to me. And I was at my house. And the other officer said something to the effect of, "Oh, you the pastor, right?" I said, "Yeah." And he sort of told the guy, "Calm down. He lives right here." It was that simple. I don't know if that story would have been the same in 06, in 07. And 2012 was rough. One of that key murder that was in December was in front of my church building on Saturday night. And they still had the tape out when I showed up to church Sunday morning. And our congregation cried. I preached outside and prayed that God would change the city and he would use his church, and that we would preach Christ Jesus and things would change. And we had a good mayor who came to my church and visited a couple times. And I have family that live there now, and they are benefiting from a new police department.
Senator Lee, if you don't mind me adding briefly, if the rules allow. So I would be remiss not to mention this. I taught in Camden, New Jersey. It was my first job out of undergrad. I taught at Morehouse College. I will be very brief. One thing to Senator Graham's, Chairman Graham's point, was they made it a particular effort to recruit from Camden. So one of my former students, Jimmy Mercado, is now a police officer in Camden. When he goes into some of the rougher neighborhoods, they know Jimmy, right? Just like they knew Pastor here, and that does make a difference to your point, Mr. Graham.
And I know this committee is an interesting experience. I enjoy it. Nobody else does. I learn a lot. What percentage of the Camden police force was minority before their
I don't have those numbers. I don't have those numbers. I know after it was like 50 some odd percent.
I can say that there are neighboring communities there, and the concern was that most people came from neighboring communities there that did not reflect.
So it really is about being from the community as much as anything else, getting out and about. That's as important as the racial makeup of the police force.
I believe so, Mr. Chairman.
The only thing I would just want to add, Senator, is there have been studies, though, about diversity in law enforcement, and of course it matters deeply for trust, but studies actually show that diversity does not impact use of force rates and misconduct in the way that one would anticipate. So it matters.
That's what I'm learning from this hearing. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here for this hearing.
For 5 Utah minutes. Okay.
I want to take a moment on Section 1983, which, as you know, is the primary vehicle for assessing liability for police misconduct. And as you also know, the primary defense against that liability, and it's even a pretrial defense, is the defense of qualified immunity, which is the subject of the Booker-Harris legislation. Now, qualified immunity, as I understand it, limits liability, narrows the window of conduct for which an officer can be held liable, and its original purpose was to protect the individual officer. At the same time that it does that, however, it has the effect of depriving the injured or wronged person of their recovery. And also, it dulls the signal back into the agency that something is wrong because they got away with it because of qualified immunity. So as we've heard today, police officers are actually almost always indemnified by their departments. And it's interesting to think of it because the only way you get by qualified immunity is if you had if a reasonable person would have known that what you did was unconstitutional. And
reasonable police officer.
Yeah, and that group of people who reasonably should have known that what they did was unconstitutional, they're the ones that are getting indemnified.
That's right.
So it's not like there's some bad cases where we don't indemnify, and the good cases we do. Indemnification is the constant here, pretty much. And in addition to the study Senator Harris cited, there's another report that described the indemnification as occurring virtually always. So one wonders, why should the department be obliged to pay? And it seems that there are a lot of obvious reasons. One, they set the policy that the officers follow. Two, they set the procedures that the officers follow. Three, they establish the training that the officers follow. Four, they dominate the culture that the officers follow. And finally, they provide the discipline that the officers must adhere to. They are the employers in a nutshell. So I look outside of the police cases to regular employer liability, and there you find an ancient doctrine, vicarious liability, respondeat superior, in which if you're acting within the scope of your employment, your employer owns it.
That's right.
And UPS drivers drive really safely because UPS knows they own those wrecks, and they're going to make darn sure. A private company that is paying for security services is going to lean towards hiring bonded security professionals because they know that if they screw up, the company owns it. So the incentives are in the right place. So here is my worry, and here's what I'd like you to think about. We've got a couple of choices here. We can leave qualified immunity alone. I think that would be a terrible mistake. So that means we should strip out qualified immunity. And then we can do one of two things. We can either just do that, and hope that indemnity survives. But, Mr. Merritt, as you said, there's going to be a flood of cases that qualified immunity defenses have kept out of the courtrooms. And right now, indemnification of officers stands on a fairly rickety structure of a mix of policy, practice, municipal ordinance, state law. You agree with that?
So far, yes, sir.
Yeah, you've tried these cases. You know this. So if there's this surge of cases because we've stripped qualified immunity away, it seems to me that we also need to lock down where everybody is right now, which is indemnification. That officers are now virtually always indemnified after we've stripped away qualified immunity. They should stay indemnified. That vicarious liability, one of the oldest and most established doctrines in the law, would provide that, and that would be a fairly sensible backstop to make sure that Chairman Graham's concerned that an officer who does something wrong doesn't lose his house, and to also meet all of our concern that the departments get behind the policies, the procedures, the training, the culture, and the discipline that will, to your point, Mr. Merritt, prevent these things from happening in the first place. So given those three choices, leave qualified immunity alone, strip out qualified immunity but don't touch indemnification, or strip out qualified indemnity and protect indemnification, make sure that officers remain indemnified, which would you recommend?
I would recommend, protecting or moving towards responding as superior, which are three options. It's the third option. That ensures the superior individual, the entity, does a quality check on their employees.
It's nothing new under the law. Respondent superior has been around forever, and it's the status quo in these cases as a matter of practice, is it not?
That's correct.
Ms. Gupta, anything to add? I've gone over 30 seconds, so keep it short.
No, I agree.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll yield back the time I've gone over.
Okay, thank you. Senator Hawley, as you can tell, 5 minutes is subjective here. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to each of you for being here today. Pastor Logan, Professor Logan, if I could come back to you. I'm just a little bit familiar with, probably not as much as I should be, but with Epiphany Fellowship, both in Philly and in Camden, and with Eric Mason, who I've had the great privilege of hearing preach many times, and with your ministry. So thank you for what you've done in those places, and thank you for your continuing ministry. Thank you. Can I just ask you to come back to your experience in Camden? And I've read your testimony, and at the risk of having you repeat yourself, but I don't think that would hopefully do anybody any harm. As you talk about the restructuring that you helped participate in there in Camden, and police coming to your block, you say in small groups of 2 or 3, and yeah, I love your line. You said our problems in Camden were not going to be solved overnight. We needed the slow cooker version. I wondered if you could just elaborate on that a little bit more for us. And you were doing it with Senator Lee, but could you just pick that back up and talk to us about what that looked like in Camden, what you saw be successful there, about building those relationships and what that meant?
Yes, I would say I always talk about crockpot ministry. It takes a long time to work it through. It's not simple, especially when we're trying to change culture. In the murder of George Floyd, he was training, an officer with 17 strikes was training other officers that day, which would have we would have trained officers with a bad culture, which would have then blended into the culture and added to the systemic issues already. And so if we're going to change something, we have to change culture. So the crockpot reality was listening and learning and then trying to legislate. The crockpot reality, the slow cooker, taking our time, was not going to be just throw money at it. It wasn't going to be just grab 20 African Americans and 20 Latinos and call that diversity. Bootleg versions of patches, but it was going to take a collective overhaul and then a long build out. And I applaud all the government workers there in Camden who took their time and worked that through. And not only was it a comprehensive overhaul, but it was a collective overhaul because they called in people from all over the city to participate in that. And that took time. I mean, Camden, we saw multiple murders. I did multiple funerals of kids under 15 on that. And then, on the other hand, felt very, very unsafe. And so all of us wanted to say, you got to fix this now. But it was a crock pot repair.
As you look back on that experience, what are the pieces that stick out to you as being the most significant, that made the most impact, that really moved the ball forward the most?
I think it was the community policing where those conversations and those relationships were developed, where they were visible and active. So that community policing was a big deal. And second was hearing from the residents and from multiple groups, particularly the pastors and different ones. And Mayor Red did good to pull in as many as she could in her time. So that relational community aspect was really a beautiful element that helped greatly.
Very, very good. Can I ask you about something else you said in your written testimony? You talk about the flaws of asking police to fix upstream problems, your words. Could you just talk to us a little bit about your experience as a pastor, what you mean by upstream problems, and just maybe tell us more what you mean about that, because I think that seems like a significant point you're making there.
Well, it's been said here on this committee that a police officer is given a task of social worker on the second decision making, and yes, it's difficult. He's social worker, he's fixing, he's dealing, he's trying to administer mercy, he's trying to do so much. And I want to give credit to those officers who navigate that. But my colleague, Mr. Merritt, has told us that we failed miserably, and we kill a lot of people in America through police, and other countries haven't. So when if my plumbing backs up, I'm not going to call an electrician because he's probably going to mess up my plumbing. So when we put plumbing problems on electricians, they mess up your plumbing. And so when we put so much on police, and that's why the system is messed up, because they shouldn't have to do that. And so the upstream problem it's difficult navigating and almost unfair. That's why we talk about the brokenness of the system.
Okay, last question, Mr. Chairman. Pastor, can you just give us an example? Give us an example of what you think of an upstream problem, a plumbing problem that we're calling an electrician for, just to help us get our hands around it.
I'll use a negative. Mr. Brooks in Atlanta, the officers showed up to ask him to talk with him. I felt that they were applying not just justice, but mercy. He was saying, I can just walk home. And so now they're navigating a few areas. Are they supposed to do justice and lock him up? Are they supposed to do mercy and honor and say, look, I'm asleep, I can go home? And so in light of that it's so much to juggle and handle. Yeah, I'm a little emotional. I saw that video and it's been messing with my head, even sitting here. But yeah, I think we give too much to do for our officers, and we don't train them properly. I think we need to parse this out and restructure completely, because we need comprehensive change and radical intervention.
Senator, if I may add to that question.
You bet.
Absolutely.
What we're finding out is that no amount of law enforcement, no amount of officers, no amount of use of force can secure a community that's stuck in poverty. Tell us we can't be the social workers, we can't be the mental and chemical health therapists, we can't be the housing counselors and all of these other things in this community. They're telling us what our communities need from their perspective on the ground. And so if we can find, as I alluded to earlier, again, $200 billion a year to pump into police prisons, we can never find the resources to raise the minimum wage, to clear the Section 8 waiting list, and to provide those social workers and all of those other things that our officers are telling us that they need. Well, then those are some of the upstream problems that officers are constantly trying to tell us that we need to address. That's why we're putting social workers in the car with to connect people to stability, to support, to solutions, instead of just creating deeper crisis when we find people who are in crisis.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think I'll lead off with that, and I appreciate Mr. Logan's words and his emotion, because I think we're all feeling that. Mayor Carter, it was hard to hear parts of your story, but just so my colleagues can hear it, you were talking about how your grandpa, Melvin Sr., worked at that railroad in Minnesota, and how he was called George. In fact, all the porters were called George, so that the white passengers only had to hear one name. And then out of that, and learn one name, your dad becomes one of the first African-American police officers in the city of St. Paul. And you talked about how you thought about your dad, and I know still do, and the people around him, the officers he knew as superheroes. And I guess my question is how you talk to those police officers now, some of whom you knew growing up, about why it is so important to have this systemic change with policing, from your personal experience.
Senator, thank you for the question, and I think that's really important to note. Our officers are just as disgusted by the video of George Floyd's murder. I had one officer recently say to me, I signed up for a dangerous job, but the notion that I could be hurt because someone's upset about something that some other officer did in some other jurisdiction, that makes me frustrated. And so we are connected with our officers, and they know that those instances don't serve them well. And they don't want to serve next to those officers, and they're frustrated when they know they cannot get my children, all of our children deserve to be able to look at our officers as those superheroes in the way that I did growing up. That's one of the reasons why it's so important that, as you mentioned, we constantly integrate our officers into our community, that we're working. We have established under Chief Axtell, our police chief, we've significantly grown our community engagement division in our police department. We established those initiatives that I mentioned earlier to ensure that we're providing pathways for youth who grow up in our city, who go to our public schools to become officers and to serve the city both as officers, as paramedics, as EMTs, and as firefighters. That is critical. They're out at our communities, as you are. You've seen them, Senator. They're out at our communities. They're engaging with people on a direct basis, so that their only engagement with people isn't just there's something wrong and I'm here to arrest you. We talk to our officers all the time about that. It's a part of our training. It's a part of our mission. And our chief always asks folks as we go about the work, in the words of our chief, of putting deposits into our bank of trust before we ever have to make a withdrawal.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to ask Ms. Gupta a question, but I'll have you follow up on the record. I know Senator Graham was asking you about other police departments, or you were responding to his question about Minneapolis, and I think you were trying to make the point that this is happening all over the country, and it's not just in one department. So I want to give you a chance on the record later to answer that, but I'm going to turn my remaining time to Ms. Gupta. And I think you know, Ms. Gupta, that I led a letter with about 26 senators asking for a pattern and practice investigation from Attorney General Barr of the Minneapolis Police Department. And do you think that such a pattern and practice investigation is needed?
Yes. Yes, I do.
And I don't know if you're aware, but right before this hearing started, and we've done 2 letters now, a group of us, I got a response, and it was from Mr. Boyd, the Assistant Attorney General, and they did not commit to doing this investigation. They said the section may initiate a civil action in the name of the United States and seek appropriate injunctive relief. We will carefully consider the evidence in this case, as well as any additional information that comes to our attention. Do you think there is enough information now out there that the whole world has seen to embark on this investigation?
I think the years of systemic problems in the Minneapolis Police Department, coupled with, of course, George Floyd's the most recent killing of Mr. Floyd, and other police misconduct in Minneapolis by the police department would merit a pattern and practice investigation. There's a pretty abundant amount of evidence.
And I also know that some of the consent decrees, when you led the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, actually required police departments to ban the use of chokeholds and other neck restraints. Is that right?
That's right.
So that's one of the examples of something that could come out of a consent decree that was a result of a pattern and practice investigation.
Yes.
And then in our state now, because we have not been able to have that Justice Department pattern and practice investigation, in addition to Attorney General's investigation, Attorney General Ellison of the case and his prosecution of the case, we now have our Minnesota Department of Human Rights stepping in to look at the department. And Senator Harris was talking about the importance of having outside investigations, which I strongly supported when I was a prosecutor. We had some issues, as you may know, with the Minneapolis police trying to take those investigations in-house. But in addition to that, states, especially now if the Justice Department isn't doing pattern and practice, could step in to actually oversee these investigations, but as well as oversee a similar version of a pattern and practice. Could you address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think both, just to get to your earlier point about chokeholds, consent decrees covered, in many instances, bans on chokeholds. They are not a substitute for national legislation on this issue, because otherwise it's just kind of jurisdiction to jurisdiction in the Justice Department, even when functioning according to its mandate, can't meet all of that. So national legislation is required. And then on this other point, on state AGs and other independent offices being able to do these investigations, it's really important that there are prosecutors and state AGs offices that are empowered to be able to take these issues on. They are going to have more trust than local DA's offices. It's just the nature of this, given the close relationship between district attorneys' offices and police departments. And so while I want the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Justice Department that is filled with expertise to be fully funded and resourced and be given the authority that it needs to have, it is also really important to be able to equip state attorneys general and independent offices to do this as well.
Thank you very much.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing. Thank you for each of the witnesses for coming. You know, this is a time when our country is torn apart, is filled with anger, is filled with rage, is filled with division. And it is my hope that through this we can find ways to come together on shared principles. Here's one proposition I believe everyone in this hearing room agrees with. What happened to George Floyd was horrific. It was unconscionable. It was clearly a grotesque abuse of police power, and the officers that carried it out are rightly being prosecuted. To the best of my knowledge, every witness here today agrees with those statements, and every senator on this committee agrees with those statements. I think all of us, regardless of party, should demand justice and should demand that the law be applied fairly, regardless of race. That's a promise that our country was founded aspiring to, and it's a promise that we have had a deeply troubled history working to achieve. I also think it is true that any time you have government power, there's a risk of abuse. And we have a responsibility to protect individual rights against the abuse of governmental authority. At the same time, I think some of the rhetoric that has been used in the wake of Mr. Floyd's killing has been inaccurate and harmful. A great many of our colleagues use the phrase systemic racism to suggest that the entire criminal justice system is imbued with racism. I don't believe that's accurate. Some of our colleagues have said, and this is a quote from earlier in the hearing, Nothing has changed from the days Dr. King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. I think that proposition is demonstrably false. A great deal has changed since then. Our country has made a journey. As my friend Senator Booker said, Dr. King pointed to the arc of history bending towards justice. We have traveled along that arc. We no longer have Jim Crow laws. We no longer have segregated schools. We no longer have open bigotry that was so pervasive just a generation ago in our country. And I think for young people to say nothing has changed gives them a false and inaccurate picture of this country. When you point to systemic racism, something our Democratic colleagues often point to as the cause of this, it is worth noting in Minneapolis, the police chief is a Democrat. The mayor is an elected Democrat. Every member of the city council is an elected Democrat. The attorney general is an elected Democrat. Both senators are elected Democrats. Now, I don't for a moment believe that every one of those elected officials is part of systemic racism and oppression. And to tell the American citizens that's what's going on is misleading them, and it's harmful. Are there bigots? Yes. Are there people who violate the law? Yes. And when they do so, they should be prosecuted, just like the officers who killed Mr. Floyd are prosecuted. But to impugn the integrity of everyone working in law enforcement is a disservice to this nation. And I want to point out in particular, there's been a lot of discussion about police officers and police forces, and defunding the police and abolishing the police has become a new political cause célèbre. I would like to point this committee to an article that came out just this month, June of 2020. It is entitled Policing the Police: The Impact of Pattern or Practice Investigations on Crime. And with the chairman's permission, I'd like to enter this article into the record. It is by two economists at Harvard University, hardly a right-wing bastion. Here's what they conclude, and it's a word of caution because there's a lot of discussion from our Democratic friends saying we need more Department of Justice pattern or practice investigations into police departments. That has become one of the frequent refrains. Let me just read from the conclusions of this study, because if we care about saving people's lives, the conclusions of this study should give us real cause for concern. Here's what the study concluded. They examined all of the police departments in which pattern or practice investigations had been launched, and they found a real difference for those investigations where there was not what they called a viral incidence of violence on a civilian. They found that did not increase crime, but here's what they found. All of the investigations that were preceded by viral incidents of deadly force have led to a large and statistically significant increase in homicide and total crimes, and here's their estimate in particular. We estimate that these investigations caused almost 900 excess homicides and almost 34,000 excess felonies. So if the members of this committee agree that Black Lives Matter, demonizing the police, causing them to pull back from protecting people's lives, will predictably cause more black lives to be taken. And so I urge that we proceed with caution, with a commitment to justice and a commitment to truth.
Thanks, Senator Cruz. Senator Coons.
Is the senator asking, allowing for responses to that statement?
No. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As all of us know, the past 3 weeks since George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, with 3 of his colleagues not intervening, has been both heartbreaking and the response nationally in some ways inspiring. It's ignited a conversation long overdue and that requires that we act. This happens in the middle of two other crises, a global pandemic and an economic crisis. Yet thousands have taken to the streets of every background and in every town in our country, demanding action to advance justice and equality. The people are leading the way, and it's up to us here in Congress to follow. In the weeks since, Rayshard Brooks' name has been added to a too long list. So let me ask you, if I could, just a few questions of Ms. Gupta and Dr. Goff. We haven't heard as much from Dr. Goff as perhaps we should, so I'm just giving him a quick warning. I'm about to ask him a question remotely. Ms. Gupta, on the line of questioning my two previous senators have pursued about these pattern and practice investigations, ones that look beyond just a focus on a single bad apple officer, but look at the way an entire agency is being run, the way a whole department is operated and its consequences. I'll remind you, Officer Chauvin had 18 prior investigations for misconduct as an officer and was, I believe, a training officer at the time of the murder of George Floyd. I was proud to join my colleagues as a co-sponsor of the Justice and Policing Act. One of the things it would give to the Department of Justice is subpoena power when conducting investigations into patterns of police misconduct. Why would that subpoena power be an important and useful tool? And how do you think pattern and practice investigations can actually ultimately advance public safety?
Sure. Senator, if I could, just as a moment of privilege, at some point would like to enter into the record the ways in which the study that Senator Cruz mentioned has been debunked, and several others that actually show the effectiveness of consent decrees, including a very recent one. And so I just wanted to state that. But on these consent decrees, the subpoena power is something that the Justice Department Civil Rights Division does not have. It was a real problem, for instance, when the Justice Department opened up a pattern or practice investigation into the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department with Sheriff Joe Arpaio. We had there a situation where the sheriff was unwilling to cooperate with the request for documents, the request for all kinds of information that is just typical around these kinds of investigations. It took at least a couple of years for the Justice Department to actually be able to litigate and win a judgment in court that gave the Justice Department access. And meanwhile, of course, the unconstitutional policing around racial profiling, national origin discrimination continued. And so without that subpoena power, it really limited the ability of the Civil Rights Division to do its full job. And it can play a factor also sometimes the police departments that may have the most entrenched policies. You don't want it to play a factor in limiting where the Justice Department is going to go, but if you've got such an uncooperative situation, the lack of subpoena power really impedes progress.
Thank you, Ms. Gupta. Dr. Goff, if I could, literally to follow up on what we were just talking about there. I'm also a co-sponsor of the End Racial and Religious Profiling Act, which is incorporated into the Justice and Policing Act. That bill would prohibit racial profiling and require data collection. Could you just briefly explain how we could use that data on stops, searches, and arrests to help achieve more equitable and more effective policing?
Absolutely. So the way that we would want to go about doing this is we don't want to just look at comparisons of rates. It's not enough to say that black people are stopped more often. It's not enough to say that black people have force used on them more often, because we don't know what the appropriate point of comparison should be, right? So Senator Cornyn asked earlier how much of this is really about poverty, right? There are times when people say that and they're not asking in good faith. I take the senator to be asking in good faith, and scientists have to ask that question as well, which means we have to take into account crime rates and poverty rates before we're able to make a determination that police have additional responsibilities above that. The robust analyses from the scientific community are clear. Crime and poverty are not sufficient to explain racial disparities in police stops or in police use of force. They are a part of the issue. They are not the whole issue. So if there were national data collection on these elements, it would be possible for both federal scientists and for the broader community of science to get a much better sense of how large is the actual level of bias in these behaviors and where can we be targeting them. That's an absolutely essential piece of the equation if we're going to solve these problems.
And Dr. Goff, as we've heard from the mayor, from Mr. Merritt, police are often our first responders to a host of problems that represent broader failings of our social safety net, lack of affordable housing, substance abuse treatment, mental health care. Can you just explain how adequately funding these social services would also reduce the burdens on police officers and hopefully lead to fewer deadly interactions between police and community members?
Right. So there are places in the United States where we don't think about policing as nearly as difficult a job as we do in our inner cities. In fact, the words inner cities have become code for where it's difficult to police because it's dangerous. The places where it's less difficult, at least in our imagination, are the places where if there's a mental health crisis, you can call a doctor or a clinician. Right? If there is somebody acting out at school, you can put them on timeout, but they're not a threat physically to anybody else. When communities have those set of resources such that they don't need to call law enforcement for every darn thing, then policing is easier. You are asking less of police departments, and communities are safer. Wherever you don't have to call the police, it's safer. Right? The code word for this in most places is the suburbs. Right? And law enforcement would very much like to be having existences, even in the inner cities, of doing the same thing, where the communities that are most distressed and most vulnerable have the resources, so they have to call less. If we invest in public mental health, right, then those resources will be there instead of law enforcement having to respond, and so forth and so on, for each of those social ills.
Well, thank you, Dr. Goff, Ms. Gupta, and our whole panel for your powerful testimony today. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. I hope it's one of several opportunities we have to talk about this. I also hope that we find a way to find common ground. I've been heartened by a lot of the comments here because it really sounds like we all understand there's a problem, we need to act on it. Then every once in a while I'll hear a drift on either my side or you all's side that makes me concerned that we're going to get close and then we're going to back off into our corners at the expense of making real progress. And I think there's a chance to make real progress. When Senator Hawley was asking about upstream challenges, it reminded me of a few things that I've tried to work on. Back in 2000, 2001, I was a town commissioner in a town in North Carolina, and we did something that it was only a town of about 25,000 people. Most people weren't doing in police departments, but we started funding and seeking accreditation for CALEA, which they've subsequently been reaccredited. They talk about use of force, de-escalation, community policing, better educating and preparing law enforcement officers for difficult and dangerous situations. I think that every law enforcement agency, all 18,000 here in the United States, need to raise the bar and make sure that they're training the officers with the best available information. So that's one upstream, making sure that our law enforcement officers are best prepared to do it. They're good people, the vast majority of them. They just need training and situational awareness where they're in these untenable positions that humans make bad mistakes. Not in the case of Floyd. That was a bad human making a bad mistake, and I hope he spends a lot of time in prison. The other upstream, it does go down to the, the way that we engage the community. One of the reasons I'm even in the Senate now, or even joined the legislature, is I challenged a two-term Republican for killing an at-risk youth center that I was trying to get put into my community in an area where if we gave these kids an idea of something other than the day that the lives they lived every day, it'd have been a safer community for them and better outcomes. He killed it, and then I killed him in a primary. And we're still working on that project. Also, I have to tell you the socio-economic piece, and Dr. Goff, I'm going to ask you a question on data because I'm a data person myself, but I remember vividly, I lived in a neighborhood in Nashville, Tennessee. Family fell on hard times, had to sell the house, moved into a trailer park about a mile and a half down the road. I can tell you, the police were cruising through that trailer park a hell of a lot more than that house I lived in a mile and a half down the road, and they looked at you differently. So there is a socioeconomic and racial component to this that we just have to recognize and work on it. Now, Dr. Goff, I think that data ultimately is going to help us do a better job of coming up with good decisions that we can come together on. I'm going to contact you because I'd like to talk about a more comprehensive view of all the factors that need to lead into it. I feel like, for example, do we have data right now that would suggest that there's a correlation between events that are occurring in a community and a bad outcome like we saw in Minnesota? Do we really have the kind of data that we need to where we could almost get to a point to where we could predict, based on certain circumstances, that we need to intervene? We need to find a way to reach out to the community or reach out to police officers and say there are signs in the community that make it more likely than not a bad outcome could occur. Is any research like that being done, or do you even get the point of my question, Dr. Goff?
I think and thank you for the question, Senator. I think the question is, can we figure out what's going to be the next Ferguson? Where's going to be the next Minneapolis? And are we currently collecting those data, and do we have the techniques to do it? And I'd say that, first of all, no, we're not collecting the data, because what we are collecting, even in major cities, the 18,000 police departments we've got, let's remember, 75% of them are 25 officers or fewer. And there's 1,000 departments that are just one guy.
And in my mind, and Dr. Goff, in my mind, it's not a matter of having to cast a wider net for data. It's a matter of having the ability to aggregate data that probably exists in one form or another so that we can use it even in a predictive way over time.
That's right. Also, we need the actual people who can do the analysis, because data don't speak to us unless we've got someone who can do a responsible analysis. But part of the question you're asking is about data from communities, because we can't get it just from police behavioral data. We need to know how the community is feeling about their law enforcement, because the same sort of on-paper shooting that happens in a community that trusts their law enforcement, feels good and feels protected, has a very different outcome, right, than a shooting that happens where folks don't trust law enforcement. So we need more and different, and we also need the capacity to do that analysis.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Chair, I can't imagine a better person to hopefully get us together and gain consensus on something that passes out of the Senate and goes to the President's desk. I would just encourage people not to draw bright red lines. Let's get something done.
Thank you very, very much. Senator Blumenthal.
Let me just say I agree. We can get something done if we do it together. And I think we're going to have to do it in the Congress because, frankly, the elephant in this room is the President of the United States, who issued an executive order today that I think almost everyone privately would agree is mostly empty promises, no real change, no real standards that can be imposed. And so we're going to have to do it on our own. I want to really lift up and give voice to some of the young people I have heard at demonstrations all around the state of Connecticut, 10 or 12 of them. A young woman, Imani Tyson, she's 16 years old, in high school in Bridgeport, and she's telling us, wake up, stand up, they're going to knock you down, stand up, they're going to run you around, stand up. I want to enter into the record all of her poetry.
Without objection.
The voice of Dion Forbes, 10 years old, 6 years younger than Imani. They kill us because we are strong. They kill us because we are powerful. Our lives matter. We deserve to breathe. That's what he said in a rally on Sunday, standing before 300 or so people in downtown New Haven. And a young musician who stood with him, Don Pearson, who said, I'm here to say, unfortunately, I don't know a black man who is not in some way George Floyd. I simply want to meet some black man in my lifetime who has never had any negative encounter with police. I could cite countless other voices. I think that Americans are awakening to them, partly as a result of my wonderful colleagues, Senators Booker and Harris. But I think we are at a moment of reckoning. And as a prosecutor, as a law enforcement person for most of my career, 4.5 years as a United States attorney and 20 years as Attorney General, I know that the best laws on the books are dead letter if they are unenforced. Almost 6 years ago, I helped to lead the Death in Custody Act, which required reporting of all deaths in custody. That law has never been implemented. The GAO reported its lack of implementation in 2018, and we still don't have those numbers or information. I think we need far more than numbers and information. We need real enforcement. And I will say that what really concentrates the mind is the prospect of a criminal conviction, a felony federal conviction. So I want to ask Ms. Gupta about Section 242. One of the principal steps in the Policing and Justice Act that you endorse persuasively in your testimony is the change in state of mind requirement that would be required from willfully to knowingly with reckless disregard. You were responsible in the Department of Justice for helping to enforce this measure. Would you please explain to Americans why that change would make a difference and why it would act as a deterrent to the kind of brutal killing that we saw in George Floyd and the other countless atrocities that have happened in recent weeks and months?
Yeah, currently the Justice Department has only one statute that they can use to prosecute police officers who violate the law criminally, and it has the highest criminal intent standard there is in the law. It requires not only that a prosecutor be able to prove that the officer used an unreasonable amount of force, but also that the officer at the time knew that what he or she was doing was unlawful, but did it anyway. And it's the willfulness standard. It has meant in far too many cases that have been terrible, terrible cases that the Justice Department has actually not had jurisdiction to prosecute. Justice Department prosecutors have long wanted to be able to expand their charging options to allow for prosecution of police misconduct cases in the criminal context with a slightly lower standard that would include reckless negligence. That having Congress give the Justice Department prosecutors this additional charging option would go a long way to ensuring that criminal individual officers that engage in these blatantly acts of misconduct would actually be held to account.
Thank you. That is one of the actions that this Congress could take, that the Department of Justice would take directly, as opposed to providing incentives or carrots and sticks, but that is the kind of action that the Department of Justice, the United States of America, could take to hold accountable police directly, correct?
Yeah, this provision is in the Justice and Policing Act. And I just want to say, for any of us that watched that video, perhaps too many times, of Officer Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd's neck, he looked straight into the cameras. He looked at them for a long time because he, in no world, imagined that he would ever be held to account for his actions. Because over and over again in this country, there has not been accountability, criminally or civil, for qualified immunity protections for officers that act this way. And there is simply no way to understand the look on Officer Chauvin's face and not look directly at our completely poor systems of accountability, which is why, in part, the Leadership Conference has pushed for these provisions to be made into law.
And as opposed to a civil action where there may be indemnification, when a policeman or anybody else is convicted of a crime, he or she has to serve the time. There's no indemnification there, correct?
Yes, and criminal accountability, as we all know, is different. I think it carries a different weight, but obviously criminal accountability, and I will say this, I said this when I was at the Justice Department, is not a substitute for the systemic reform and the kind of reforms that deal with the culture of policing, that deal with the training and the accountability systems and the like, but it is a crucial part of the kind of tools that are required.
And I'll just finish by saying I totally agree with you on systemic reform. I think that the Justice and Policing Act is a great and powerful first step toward it. I think criminal culpability is a pretty powerful deterrent to police misconduct. And we need to widen the lens and make sure we eradicate racism in education and healthcare and housing. But it's a pretty powerful deterrent if we can adopt that kind of change.
Thank you. Senator. Thank you. Senator.
Thank you very much. This has been just truly an exceptional discussion, I think, this afternoon, and something that is very long overdue. So thank you, Mr. Chair, very much for holding this session today. You know, as a senator, we try to be very objective as we see different situations in front of us, and you try not to have a personal reaction. But I think every single one of us, as we watched the video of George Floyd, had a very visceral, very personal reaction. And especially as Mr. Floyd was in his last breath, you know, calling out to his mother. I think there are so many of us that are mothers, and I can't imagine if that had been my daughter. I don't have a son, I have a daughter. If that had been her, that had been abused by a person in authority. It should never happen. It should never happen. And that person in authority was a police officer. So we are brought here today to reckon with that fact and to understand that there has been injustice for a very long time. And this is a very uncomfortable conversation that some of us are having. It is very uncomfortable because we don't like to talk about racism, and we don't like to talk about the fact that there might be injustice in this wonderful country. And it is a wonderful country, which is why we have the opportunity to come together and work together and correct some of these things. So I'm just really grateful to have the opportunity to be part of a group that will be able to make some difference. So Senator Grassley did mention that Iowa is leading the way. They have already passed a criminal justice reform bill. And I'm very proud of them. It was historic. And our Governor, Kim Reynolds, she signed House File 2647, which really is historic police reform, adding additional accountability for law enforcement that benefits both the community and those in policing. The bill included, and this is just a few of those key reforms, they are prohibiting the use of chokeholds. I think that's a wonderful step that all of our states need to grab hold of, literally. Preventing an officer from being hired in Iowa if they have previously been fired for misconduct, which is something we have seen over and over again, the rehiring of those bad apples. Mandating yearly anti-bias and de-escalation training, and the bill allows the Iowa Attorney General to prosecute a criminal offense committed by an officer if their actions result in the death of another, which is an important step. And here's something else that's pretty darn remarkable about the bill, is that it passed unanimously in both of our bodies, the House and the Iowa Senate. There was not a single point of dissension. And I truly hope that within this body we can all come together. There will be some items that maybe we don't agree on, but let's find a path forward. Let's find a way, and let's see if we can come together and have a unanimous decision in this body. So there is a lot of talk about defunding the police. And I know that that's a quick and provocative soundbite, but I think there are other ways that we can go about reforming police. I do believe that we can add additional support for our police, whether it's the form of mental health counselors, those that specialize in de-escalation. And I would like to ask our panel, and I know I'm running out of time, but, you know, there are ways that we can go beyond the actions on the ground as well. We do still have problems with authority within our prison system as well. And all of my questions were answered. So I am working on a bill with Senators Blumenthal and Booker that address what we call a law enforcement consent loophole. And that is where sexual misconduct occurs in our prison systems, where a correctional officer will gain the consent of an inmate to have sexual intercourse or other sexual activity. And those abuses still exist in our system as well. And I think not only do we need to address those law enforcement officials that are out on the ground, but we also need to be looking beyond that in other law enforcement and justice situations where we can make corrections. I think this is a time to do that, and I appreciate working with my colleagues across the aisle on a number of these issues. And I apologize that I didn't get to questions, but I mean, do you think that this would be an appropriate time to address some of those issues as well?
I believe the heart of the matter here, the issue of police brutality in this country is directly tied to mass incarceration. We build so many prisons. We incarcerate more people than anyone in human history. We send our police force. Their mission is to go keep those prisons filled with drug users, with sick people, with poor people, according to our laws, when those people need treatment, not incarceration.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Hirano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gupta referred to some material that she wanted to enter into the record, and I'd like to ask the chair to have those materials entered.
Without objection.
I'd also like to thank Dr. Goff for pointing out that if a community has the